fiscal policy will not change the outcome. Now, there are different reasons for those two conclusions, but let me start with monetary policy. They keep saying this is stimulus. The Fed cut rates, that's stimulus. The Fed's printing money, that's stimulus. They guaranteed the corporate bond market. They guaranteed the municipal bond market. They're buying mortgages. They're buying, everything in sight, and that's stimulus. Well, they are buying everything in sight or guaranteeing it. That's true, but it's not stimulus. And the reason it's not is because of velocity. Velocity is the turnover of money. So a simple way to think about nominal GDP, what's the money supply and what's the velocity, the turnover of money? If you have $1 in the banking system, does it support $3 of goods and services or $1 of goods and services or $0 of goods and services? And the example I give is, I go out to dinner and I tip the bartender, and the bartender takes a taxi home and tips the taxi driver, and the taxi driver puts gas in her car. Well, in that example, my dollar has velocity of 3 because you had $3 of goods and services, the bar tab, the taxi tab, and the gasoline. But what if I stay home and watch television and leave my money in the bank? Well, that has velocity of 0 because I'm not spending it. And the point is, I always say you don't need calculus for this. Fifth grade math does fine, but $5 trillion times 0 is 0. Mm-hmm. Meaning if you don't have velocity, you don't have an economy. So all this, Austrian, neo-Keynesian, monetarist stuff about, if you expand the money supply, you're going to get inflation. No, we quadrupled the money supply between 2008 and 2013 or 2014 and got no inflation. And we're doing it again, and we still have no inflation. We're probably going to have deflation. And the reason is that inflation has nothing to do with money printing. It has everything to do with velocity, and velocity is psychological. And the Fed forgot this. I don't know if they ever knew it, but they seem to have forgotten this along the way. And changing psychology is very different than changing the printing press. And let me give you some hard numbers. Savings rate in May in the United States went to 33%. Oh. Now, it was running about 5 or 6%, which is, not the highest, but pretty high. And when Americans are really lean and mean, they're saving 8%. They saved 33%. But think of the reasons for that. So let's say you lost your job. Well, you're definitely going to save. You got to pay the rent. You might not be able to pay the rent, but if the government gave you a stimulus check, which they did, people didn't run right out and go to dinner. They put it in the bank. Let's say you still have your job. You were not unemployed. Well, you're probably saving too, because who knows if you're next? It's just, even people who kept their jobs are worried that they'll be the next ones to get fired. And by the way, we're experiencing a second wave of layoffs, and I can explain why. Everyone's worried about the second wave of the virus, and that's a legitimate concern. But right after the pandemic hit, the shutdown hit in March, there were 50 million Americans who applied for unemployment benefits. In other words, they lost their jobs. But at the same time, they had this payroll protection plan bill. The number was well over $1 trillion. I don't have the exact number off the tip of my tongue, but it was close to $1 trillion. Now, but that was conditional. The government would give you the money. You had to apply, but the government would give you the money. But only if you kept your employees, if you didn't fire your employees. If you fired your employees, you had to pay it back. But if you did not fire your employees, the loan is forgiven. So in effect, it was a grant. Well, and it was supposed to last for 3 months. Well, guess what? The 3 months are up at the end of July. So people who got the money and kept the payroll, so they did not fire their employees, they don't have to pay back the loan. That was the deal. But now that they're out of that time frame, they are firing their employees. Like, well, this is the idea of the bridge loan. It was a 3-month bridge loan from March to June. And now June has passed, July has passed, these programs are running out. And so now a lot of people who did not get fired in March or April because their employers got these loans and they were kept on and the money was used for the intended purpose. Now the employer does not have to pay it back. But now that period has expired, they can fire them and still not have to pay the loan back because the money's gone. And they are.
Before we continue, help us clicking that YouTube like button and subscribe now to our channel. This shows the algorithm that you valued this information. And it helps us spread that message. Sharing is caring. And now, let's continue.
So we're seeing now a new massive wave of terminations and layoffs, and even people who didn't get fired, had their pay cut in half. I know so many people, they still have their jobs, but they've been told, one's a pilot for a major airline, another one is a senior marketing executive in New York. They're, friends and family, as neighbors, people and they still have their jobs, but they've been told that their pay has been cut in half. And if it sounds harsh, okay, it is, but consider the fact that airline revenues are down 90%. Commercial rents in some cases are down 90% because the tenants aren't paying. So how do you pay your staff in a real estate business if no one's paying you? And so this has led, obviously it whacks consumption. That's easy to see, but the savings rate goes sky high. So what happens if you save? What's the velocity of your money? It's zero. And so all the money printing in the world will not generate GDP if people don't spend it and they're not spending it. So that's why monetary policy fails. Flip over to fiscal policy. There's another $5 trillion. We used to think $1 trillion was a lot of money, but now it's
five.
Yeah, those are the good old days. So we're spending $5 trillion. And everyone's like, well, that's stimulus. And I said, no, they are spending $5 trillion. Yes, they do know how to do that, but it's not stimulus because this gets into the research of Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart. They were recently both professors at Harvard. Their book, This Time is Different. Everyone has heard of it pretty much, but they've also written a whole series of papers, and they show convincingly over centuries, developed economies, developing economies, all economies, 19th century, 20th century, et cetera, that when your debt to GDP ratio goes over 90%, the Keynesian multiplier goes below 1, meaning you can borrow $1 and spend $1, but you only get maybe 60 cents or 70 cents of GDP. In other words, you've crossed a threshold, you're through the looking glass, and you're now at a point where not only do you not, the old theory, the Keynesian theory was borrow $1, spend $1, and get $1.30 of GDP because of velocity, because of what we talked about earlier. Well, now it's like borrow $1, spend $1, and get maybe 70 cents of GDP. So what happens? So what's happening to your debt to GDP ratio? Well, your debt's going up dollar for dollar, but your GDP is only going up, say, 70 cents on the dollar. So your ratio is going up even higher, making the problem even worse. And people say, well, you can't borrow your way out of a debt crisis. Well, sometimes you can, but not when your debt is this high. And so monetary policy falls down because of velocity. Fiscal policy falls down because the debt to GDP ratio is too high. And then that induces a behavioral response. People will go, well, I'm not a macro economist. I don't know how the U.S. is going to get out of it, but I know I'm going to have to pay. They're either going to default on the debt, raise my taxes, or cause inflation, and which is just a form of tax. Yeah. So people say, well, look, I don't know how this is going to work out, but I know it's going to come. It's going to come on me. I'm going to have to pay. So people save more. They do the exact opposite of what the economists assume, because people have more sense than most economists. And so whether it's fear of losing your job makes you save more, or fear of inflation and taxes down the road makes you save more. Either way, you save more. Now, savings can be a good thing if you can put it into productive investment, but query, can we do that? China doesn't. They just waste the money, and the U.S. doesn't seem to be able to agree on an infrastructure bill. But even then, even if you do it right, and I would say we're not doing it right, but even if you did do it right, that's a 5 to 10 year payoff. Well, 5 to 10 years is a long time when you're in a depression. Our economy runs on consumption. Consumption is 70% of GDP. So when you substitute savings for consumption, it might have some benefits 5 years from now, but that's a really long time. And that's why I call it a depression. So there's no way out of this.